So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this morning for this month's case study meeting with Marek Doyle. We are just slowly sort of getting more people joining in as we speak. So hopefully in the next minute or so, we'll have a few more of you. So this morning's case study is all about the presentation of anxiety and insomnia in the organic acids test. And also we're going to talk very briefly about the GI effects as well. We're joined with Marek Doyle this morning, which is really great. I'm super excited to learn from Marek. Marek is a functional nutritional therapist who has spent the last 17 years building a model of personalized nutrition based on data of over 3,000 individual outcomes, 11,000 test results, and extensive use of the scientific literature. Marek is based in London, and he offers one-to-one consultations for clients as well as training for practitioners, which you'll be hearing some more about towards the end of the presentation. And lastly, Marek also holds a master's in personalized nutrition. So I'll hand it over to you, Marek, to introduce yourself further and introduce the case study.
Okay, great. Well, there's probably not a huge amount that I would add from that. The relevant stuff is what we're about to discuss. So in that regard, yeah, the case study that we're looking at here is a 31-year-old male who came to me with some anxiety and insomnia issues. But of course, as is normally the case, there's a little bit more to it. And that was over to me not only to identify, but most importantly, in this case, as with many others, to actually, convince the guy in question that there was some additional steps that we were needing to take. And so, yeah, I thought it's probably useful for context to outline how I seem to have a lot of individuals who've gone on long journeys before coming to see me. And yeah, that obviously is relevant whenever we're breaking down these test results, because it's entirely feasible that some of these patterns will become a regular feature for a lot of those who are tuning in, depending on the type of individuals that tend to seek them out. Of course, these patterns may be something they only see from time to time, but come what may, I hope what's going to be useful is to provide some framework with which to make good use of the data and go a little bit beyond the this market equals low, therefore provide vitamin Y. We can put together a picture, and I think that's going to be the theme of this one.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so if I get going then on this, basic details I obviously started to touch on there. I think the obvious takeaway from the case history here is that there's a sign of a growing burden on the system. From the very early years, we can obviously imagine the potential problems that come from regular antibiotic use, and therefore not too difficult to make a link between that and the digestive issues that he experienced throughout his teens. And yeah, also relevant is this particularly high stress lifestyle, heavy workout schedule, very substantial hours that he's working. In any case, yeah, my thoughts at this early stage are always as to whether we think that these problems that he's previously faced, are they solved or are they simply being managed? And equally, when somebody's working out very heavily most days and they're working all hours God sends, do we think that that schedule and that additional stress is helping them, or is it simply helping them to mask some of the issues. So yeah, more details as to where he was at when we first started working together. So he hadn't introduced an official low FODMAP diet, but it was certainly a dietary intake which bore a lot of hallmarks within that. So for those who aren't familiar with the low FODMAP approach, this relates to avoiding various vegetables and fruits and grains that would contain these various types of carbohydrates, so the fructans, the oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. In any case, these are the fibers that do a great job of feeding bacteria, which is why they are generally so good for us. But equally, should there be a disturbance in the microbiome, then we can see these very same fibers deployed by the undesirable microbes, and bloating and other disturbances are quite common. So he's very much in a case that he's not solving those issues, but managing them. Equally, another key feature was that his overall mood and well-being seemed very heavily linked to being able to enforce a very large amount of training. And as soon as he picked up a particularly bad injury, one that was enough to stop him, that's when suddenly we started to see a number of changes. Very relevant that these are autonomic changes in nature, digestion and insomnia being the most obvious areas we often see the autonomic challenges playing out. And what really defined the challenges that he was experiencing is the fact that anything that tended to help him, anything that tended to give him either improved concentration, mental sharpness, or enhanced mood, invariably caused him worsened insomnia. So something that falls into the category of paradoxical effect, and we'll touch on that in a little bit more detail. So yeah, the basic breakdown here, I've just grouped some patterns into categories. Those who are more familiar with the adrenal, hypothalamic, pituitary adrenal axis dysregulation will probably recognize some of these patterns in the first paragraph. A lot of those classic symptoms we tend to see when there are adrenal issues. And equally, energy issues in regards to the fatigue, brain fog, cold hands and feet, feeling worse for exercise. Equally, some very clear signs in regards to some potential mast cell and histamine issues with the bloating, with the puffiness, etc. And equally, yeah, some patterns that give us some insight as to where he's at in regards to that central nervous system and the autonomic function, as we mentioned. So dietary wise, tended to be pretty strict on managing the diet, and that's obviously fairly common for us to see in individuals when dietary change has made such a big difference. Obviously was relevant that by the time I got to see him, there wasn't really any benefit to be gained anymore from these dietary changes, but because they'd had such a positive effect in the past, there was obviously some enthusiasm on his part for sticking with that. And yeah, we noticed that there was some potential problems with cruciferous vegetables, which we will come back to shortly. And equally, some challenges in the consumption of higher fat meals, which was interesting. There was no digestive disturbances that he saw following them, but fatigue was a very common response to that. So, and that's a pattern that often seems to go ignored, but very well worthwhile in focusing on that at times, what can that tell us? Well, it's difficult to make any assumptions as to what that is exactly or is not. But yeah, one very common pattern I see that fits the bill there is when individuals are holding excessive postural tension, excessive neuromuscular tension in the intestines, very under discussed subject. Well, anytime there's a substantial increase in bile, then we can often see the contractions that bile so reliably induces. It helps with peristalsis for that reason. But what if there is some tendency towards spasm in the intestines? What will be the impact of the bile there? So already a little clue as to the role of tension, and that adds to that picture of autonomic dysregulation, which we're going to unpack as we go. So yeah, this is where I think the autonomic central nervous system regulation is a particularly interesting angle to come in from. So he's clearly very, very busy, huge loading of hours, but the most interesting thing of all, and a pattern that is hardly unusual for us to see, is that he feels so much better for making sure that he's busy around the clock. In other words, if he takes his foot off the accelerator for just a second, suddenly things don't tend to play out so well for him. He feels a whole lot worse. And yeah, naturally, we see him engage further as a means to avoid and yeah, turn away from how he feels when he stops. So yeah, that is particularly relevant when it comes to the injury that he had recently experienced, the one that had stopped him from going to the gym on a regular basis and suddenly started to feel worse. So it's just worth taking a moment to consider, well, what do we think is going on here? And a really common pattern to see is how, provided somebody is very deep into that sympathetic mode, this adrenaline dominant state, well, they are somewhat fortified and buzzed by the chemical setup that comes with that. They also benefit from the numbing that occurs, that they don't tend to feel the inner environment in the same way, exactly as nature intended. Adrenaline thrusts us into an outward focused state, which does certainly enhance our ability to spot and respond to threats. But it also means that we don't get access to the same delivery of sensory inputs. And that's particularly relevant when it comes to the transmission of those core sensations and core impulses, be that anger, fear, sadness, disgust, etc., as laid out as these core emotive networks. PANCSEP is a good reference to lean on there if those out there want to break that down further. In any case, yeah, what happens to his physiology whenever the adrenaline drops, whenever he's now able to receive those sensations? How does he respond to them? Not very well is the question. So that's one big thing. So sorry, Anastasia, you're saying.
I just wanted to go back. What was the resource that you just mentioned there?
So yes, a researcher, PANCSEP, has released a number of papers, including a number of reviews. Perhaps we'll put that into some show notes that I can rustle together on my website. But equally, a more user-friendly resource that could be useful for those interested would be a book called It's Not Always Depression by Hilary Jacobs Hendel, which actually is a book I often end up recommending to clients, including the individual we're talking about here, just as a means to eloquently explain what is otherwise a fairly complex subject and speak to those 7 core emotive networks and the way that the body is obligated to express the impulses that come with them, similar to any toddler that we've ever observed. Except, of course, mammals often need to inhibit the impulse in order to get along in society, and thus we have secondary circuits that can be deployed specifically for that purpose. Inhibition is something that allows us not to express our anger in the midst of discussion work, or not to express sadness and break down in tears in the midst of a public presentation, etc. And so, yeah, it provides a lot of benefits in a complex mammalian society. However, it feels awful and reliably induces quite potent feelings of anxiety unless we find a way to numb ourselves to that, which is where we can either deploy reframing, something that uses our prefrontal cortex and is very energy intensive and often has been deployed successfully by a lot of the individual will work with until their energy metabolism is disturbed and there isn't sufficient energy to invest in that same structure. And thus they're left with either distraction or adrenaline or physical tension, which works extremely well to block the transmission of those inner sensations. So yeah, very interesting how almost every single traditional healing system focuses quite heavily on physical tension and speaks of things like body armor. And whereas neurobiology in recent years has actually demonstrated the mechanisms as to how that works, specifically in the way there's this relay station in our brain called the insula, which passes on these inner sensations. And its role is affected in a big way when we hold that tension, which isn't always that traditional shoulders by the ears pattern. It can be a whole lot more subtle, not as visible. Thus, we might see it in the diaphragm or the hip flexors or the intestines. So I hope that lays it out in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, what were the highlights from his initial organic acids test? So one of the obvious areas that really stood out was the mitochondrial picture. We'll look at the rest of the mitochondrial factors shortly, but certainly the carbohydrate metabolism stood out. And what's interesting here is that if we just look at this one section for glycolysis, this would have all the hallmarks of low magnesium. Now, it's hardly unusual to see low magnesium in individuals. In fact, it's one of the most reliable things that we can provide individuals who've been under any metabolic burden for so long, because it tends to increase their magnesium usage. However, this is something that I would be keen to interpret in light of what we're seeing in the mitochondria at large. Now, I'm going to hone in straight away on the aconitic acid marker, because this is not only something that I see in well over 60% of long-term individuals who just don't quite respond the way they should, but also this has been just absolutely central to being able to give these individuals a fair chance. Now, why is this? Why is this so important? Well, it's important because of what it tells us. So it's worthwhile at this point just touching on the way that when we compare the mitochondria to an energy furnace for the cell, there's a lot of value in that analogy, because this is a point where there is combustion occurring between oxygen from the air and the electrons from food. And that occurs in that final stage of energy metabolism, that is to say, the electron transport chain, which can be compared to a conveyor belt, which just moves these electrons into the furnace so that they can be combusted with oxygen, and ATP can be formed as a result. So all good and well, unless, of course, we see a lack of oxygen being available in the mitochondria. In those circumstances, we cannot expect the furnace to operate at the same rate, and it doesn't. And that's where we would see this backing up and stacking up of all of these electrons in the electron transport chain, in that conveyor belt. And that's a really big deal, because this excess of highly reactive energy compounds in this conveyor belt, this is not what we want. Too much highly reactive energy compounds is going to result in a lot of reactions and potential damage to the cell. Now, fortunately, evolution has provided us with a solution, and this is where a slowdown of the flow of those electrons is conducted. And it's done so by slowing down that enzyme aconitase, the very enzyme that forms aconitic acid. So whenever we see that that's a slow conversion into aconitic acid and lower levels of aconitic acid, this is a really strong clue for hypoxia in the mitochondria. Now, it's possible that it could be pseudo-hypoxia, whereby there is so much oxidative stress that the body is actually leaning on this very same response. So again, context is important, but very, very relevant that we do see this in a lot of individuals with chronic fatigue, issues that just simply refuse to respond the way that they should. And certainly a pattern that I've seen again and again is that for these individuals, we might be able to stabilize them, to settle the system, but we don't get the dramatic shift that we're aiming for until we get on top of this. So before we move on from this, I want to give it some context as to how we wish to look at this. And so the single most common driver whenever we see this hypoxia picture is due to stress and inflammation. And the way that this plays out is that the stress response is activated, and it's really helpful at this point to recognize how the stress response primary focus is to get more energy into the bloodstream so that the individual is better equipped to meet the expected challenge, whether that challenge indeed comes or not. That's the purpose of it. And so, yes, we're very familiar with the way the stress response will induce the release of energy from the stores in the liver, the stores in the fat cells, or indeed the muscles. But most important here is the way that the stress response opens up the gut lining, and that allows little fragments of dead bacteria, aka endotoxins, aka lipopolysaccharides. It now allows them to get into the bloodstream. Now, we don't really worry if they exist in the gut, but it is a problem when they now get into the bloodstream, because the cruel irony there is that these are not complete bacteria. They are not capable of infecting us. But unlike complete bacteria that actually use their cell membranes to kind of sort of hide from the immune system, well, now we've got so much more bacterial DNA on display, and we can see quite a potent immune response as a consequence. That immune response will involve a substantial release of nitric oxide. And of course, nitric oxide in the right amounts, in the right zones, can be very helpful. But when it's in excess and it's impacting the conditions in the mitochondria, this is where it can now compete with oxygen. So this is a really important driver for these low oxygen patterns that we can see on the organic acids test. And it's just so relevant here that if that's involved, then we're not going to be able to get any major progress until we get on top of this pattern. And this pattern works as a cycle because while you've got low energy production, well, what is that forcing the body into doing? It's going to need to activate the stress response more readily and with more force just to undertake normal day-to-day activities. Because what is the purpose of the stress response? Well, that primary purpose is to ensure that you have enough energy in the bloodstream in order to meet the expected demands that are coming. And the lower the energy metabolism in your hypothalamus, the more we're going to see that induce a stress response, which of course can then sustain what we're seeing. So this is where anything that we can do to dampen down that stress response, and this is where the cortisol activity can be so vital. Cortisol is so often called the stress hormone, but better described as the hormone that helps us cope with stress and switches off the stress response as soon as it's no longer needed. And that's a really good starting point to consider, is there sufficient cortisol? And equally, how are the cortisol receptors performing? Whenever there's endotoxemia, there is an automatic downregulation of the sensitivity in those cortisol receptors, and that can leave people with real problems in controlling the inflammatory response, which is so dominated by the nitric oxide, which in turn competes with oxygen. And thus we've got energy issues and, of course, a need for more of a stress response just to find that additional energy to get through the day. So I wanted to put that into context. An additional consideration would be anemia. Is there any problems with oxygen delivery? If so, yeah, that will do it too. Equally, is there any hydrogen sulfide production in the gut? That's another chemical which is absolutely no problem at low levels, but at higher levels can compete with oxygen. So hydrogen sulfide can be formed from sulfurous foods. So again, we will don't want to spoil what's coming in regards to the stool test, but yes, whenever there is both issues with sulfurous foods, for example, the cruciferous vegetables, and we're seeing this hypoxia marker, there's definitely an angle of inquiry there. So why did I jump to this before going back to the glycolysis? Because whenever we're seeing hypoxia, we should, by definition, see a dramatic increase in the use of the backup pathway, aka the glycolytic pathway, aka that lactic acid pathway. In other words, we should see more pyruvic acid and more lactic acid here. And indeed, that's what we'll see in a lot of people that have predictable responses to treatment. We'll typically see that in individuals who are suffering with IBS or arthritis or inflammatory issues. But interestingly enough, a lot of people with chronic issues that don't respond the way they should, we see this paradoxical drop in the glycolytic activity. So is that just down to magnesium, or is there something else going on? Well, the reliability with which this pattern comes alongside hypoxia tells us that no, we need to look beyond magnesium. In other words, we're seeing all the signs here of a failed response to hypoxia. In other words, this is where our oxygen sensors in the cells aren't doing what we would expect them to do in a low oxygen environment. And so the question we need to ask is why? Why would there be low oxygen, but the oxygen sensors not act on it? And this is a really relevant connection to iron metabolism, which we will touch on. And the key thing there being, we need to recognize that the oxygen sensors don't actually sense oxygen. They sense an oxygen product, which, if we're using biochemical terms, we are calling them hydroxyl radicals. However, in everyday life, we would just simply call it rust. The product that is formed when oxygen and iron react together. And as they are both highly reactive molecules, yeah, we will get plenty of that when there's plenty of oxygen. However, the question I would pose here is what happens if there is too much iron in storage? When this occurs, we can very easily end up with too much hydroxyl formation, that is to say, too much rust, and that tricks the oxygen sensors into thinking there's tons of oxygen when there isn't. The oxygen sensors think there's tons of oxygen, they're not going to call for any more, and thus they are not going to induce the hypoxia response. They are not going to induce compensatory activity in the glycolytic pathway, and that's the picture that I'm picking up from here. So,
sorry, Marek.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would you also, when you're looking at the low pyruvic and the low lactic acid, would you also relate that back to his carbohydrate intake, in the sense that it could be a bit too low for the energy output that he has on a daily basis with his high training and stress?
So I think that's a very important question to ask. I don't think that's what's going on. And the main reason being because, having seen hundreds of these organic acids tests from people who are on a low carbohydrate diet and on a excessively low carbohydrate diet in many cases, that's not a relationship that I see. In other words, all of the tests indicate a picture whereby, as long as you've got reasonable levels of bloodstream and reasonable uptake through the insulin receptor and then into this glycolytic pathway, the body should be absolutely fine to maintain normal levels of pyruvic acid and lactic acid, even on a low carbohydrate diet, simply because there's always a suitable level of glucose in the bloodstream, or at least there should be. So it is definitely a feasible connection, no doubt, but that's definitely not what I would be looking at here, simply because even on lower levels within the normal range, maybe 4 nanomoles per liter of glucose in the bloodstream, that should still be enough. Plus, of course, when he's got this high adrenaline lifestyle, adrenaline is a fantastic agent at driving high blood sugar levels. So again, there should be more than enough availability to serve these pathways. So that's why I'm looking at there being something more going on here, and especially where we see this hypoxia pattern, which, as I said, sometimes is pseudo-hypoxia, but in any case, that should automatically drive a higher level of production, and thus a higher level of usage of this glycolytic pathway, more lactic acid, not less. So yeah, really strong pattern here to tell us that not only is there a lack of oxygen, but also the response that we would expect to the lack of oxygen, well, that's not forthcoming.
Thanks, Marek.
No worries. So straight away, that's a real central pattern. On top of that, we want to consider, well, is there anything else that we can pick up on that? Well, yeah, the other thing that stands out straight away is the role of the malic acid. So malic acid is always a really interesting one to look at, mainly because the enzyme that onwardly converts it is called malic acid dehydrogenase. Nothing relevant about the name. What is relevant is that it's thyroid responsive. So while there can be an important role for NAD, which is a mitochondrial form of niacin, aka vitamin B3, there's definitely something important that we can take from there as to the role of thyroid hormones, specifically the activity of these thyroid hormones at cellular level. So this is where I would always be keen to look into factors that affect thyroid transport. The single biggest factor there is energy availability in the mitochondria, energy availability in the cell, which, as we can imagine, a cell on low energy availability doesn't want more thyroid hormones in, because what do? They improve the performance of the cell, they induce the activity that we want from the cell, but all thyroid responsive enzymes are energy intensive. That is to say, they will use up our energy that's in the cell. So that's where, whenever I see this marker, I'm very interested to know, is there a role for reduced thyroid transport into the cell? Because these are the individuals that so commonly have this whole host of low thyroid symptoms, but guess what? Their bloodstream looks totally normal. The thyroid markers there don't show any disturbances. And so that's where, yeah, straight away, we want to consider, is the thyroid transport actually occurring the way that it should? So yeah, step number one in those situations is to ensure there's enough energy production, and thus we're straight back to that initial discussion on hypoxia, oxygen management, investigations as to the role of that stress and endotoxemia and nitric oxide, but also hydrogen sulfide, and also any iron issues. So yeah, that's step number one. But equally, if there's any insulin resistance, that can lead to high levels of fatty acids in the bloodstream. That can inhibit thyroid transport. So too, bacterial derived metabolites in the gut. So too, putrefaction of proteins in the gut. So yeah, there's a few areas that we can look into there. I've actually got an article on my website about cellular hyperthyroidism, and yeah, what we can do from a nutritional basis. So yeah, very interesting one there on the potential role of thyroid activity, or the lack thereof, but equally succinic acid. So succinic acid can be raised whenever there's a lack of the cofactors it needs, one of which being vitamin B2, another one being coenzyme Q10. But another interesting takeaway is how the enzyme that's responsible for its onward conversion is adrenaline responsive. In other words, if we provide B2 or CoQ10 and we don't see any response, we don't see the improvements that we should be seeing, then that's where we can actually end up yeah, looking at adrenaline resistance. If somebody has had a substantial output of adrenaline for a long period of time, it's a very normal compensation that we'll see across the body, that the response to that becomes downregulated in compensation. That is to say, once the body's used to living in an emergency, it now says, well, I'm not going to respond to standard emergencies anymore. It needs to be a mega emergency in order for you to get that adrenaline response. And so, yeah, that's another perfect example of something that doesn't automatically mean that it's low B2 or low CoQ10 or adrenaline resistance, and thus is really worthwhile contextualizing. And obviously, in his particular case, yeah, there's definitely something to be said there for, yes, he does have a high adrenaline lifestyle, and he feels very underwhelmed, very sluggish, like a zombie, if he takes away that stress, or indeed if he sleeps for 8 hours, as we mentioned in the text earlier on. So yeah, a number of things that can play a role there, and equally, yeah, the alpha ketoglutarate acid. So this is often where we'll see problems if there's a lot of proteins that are being used to fuel energy. This is where they'll enter. So yes, is there any shortages of important cofactors there, with B6 being the main focus point for when we're looking at any amino acids being interconverted? So yeah, that's another area for consideration. So something we'll hold with us as we then look into the nutrients. Okay, so neurotransmitter markers, an interesting one here because this is a very common finding to see, again, with individuals who have the more complex chronic issues that don't seem to respond so well. Now, this isn't something that I'm looking at as a case of, oh, brilliant, he must have really high serotonin activity. He must therefore be awash with peace and love. Instead, I'm looking at this and considering, well, where does most serotonin in the body come from? Well, about 95% of it comes from the gut. And so therefore, yeah, we're seeing a lot of activity in terms of serotonin formation and metabolism. And that's where I think it's really important to consider the role of certain immune cells. Platelets can form serotonin, but so too can mast cells. These very specific subgroup of immune cells that can be called first responders, who are given the task of changing the conditions in the local environment so that their buddies, the rest of the immune system, can get into the local area and waste products can get out. And the main thing that they do there to help is to pump out a lot of histamine. And yes, they also pump out serotonin when activated. So that doesn't, again, tell us with certainty this is a mast cell issue, but it's something that I would expect to see whenever mast cell issues are suspected. And yes, we've already identified a potential role for them in some of the symptoms that we were seeing. So very relevant commentary there in terms of could there be a need to help stabilize mast cells, and that's where magnesium status, carbon dioxide, and therefore the role for correcting hyperventilation, something again that's very under discussed in our world, or equally using mast cell stabilizers, quercetin, luteolin, etc., being the most common ones used. And they can be helpful, but typically in the early stages, we're going to get much more success by removing the triggers for mast cell degranulation or the factors that increase instability. And in that regard, microbial barcodes, anytime bacteria are in excess, that's potentially relevant. Equally, mold, allergies, environmental exposure can be a big deal, but possibly the most important and the one that often doesn't get the attention is the stress response. We know that when the hypothalamus determines that a stress response is appropriate, it initiates that whole cascade of events, starting with one chemical, CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. And that is what arrives at the pituitary, initiating that onward cascade. But what's so important here is that there's one type of immune cell that have receptors for CRH, and that's the mast cells. Not only that, if you have excessive mast cell activity, we need to consider where we're likely to see changes in the picture. And yes, any barrier of the body, especially gut lining, is particularly rich in mast cells, but so too the amygdala and the hypothalamus. In other words, if you're going to have excessive mast cell activity and histamine release, we can expect there to be much more agitation. In other words, a further self-perpetuating cycle that involves the stress response. One in this example whereby the stress response destabilizes the mast cells pump out more histamine, and not only does that cause the typical symptoms in the gut and the general puffiness that we're used to, but it can also agitate the limbic system into much more stress response than would otherwise be seen, and thus the cycle continues. So yeah, very, very useful angle to look at this marker from, especially in light of the context that we've already gathered. But equally, yeah, what can that tell us? Can we then retest that later on and see how that's changed? Here's some other neurotransmitter metabolites, which generally tell us about two things. One, we're seeing a serotonin steal. Kyanurenic acid, quinolinic acid, xanthorenic acid. These are all metabolites that occur when the body is stealing from tryptophan in order to try to form more NAD+. So very common if the body's under stress, if the body is challenged through inflammatory processes, which of course is simply another form of stress, there's naturally likely to be a desire for more NAD. And that's where, yeah, stress-related enzymes like TDO or inflammatory-related enzymes like IDO will steal from the serotonin pathway, and it just takes tryptophan and pulls it outwards. So not only does that speak to what the body's trying to achieve, but equally when we have insufficient B6, we'll often see that increase in xanthorenic acid in particular, but equally the others do tell us a story. So yeah, having seen that low alpha-ketoglutarate acid marker and now having seen these markers, there's definitely something to be said for B6 and what that might do for him.
All right.
Okay, sorry. Yes, go for it.
Would you also see altered tryptophan metabolism in the context of the presence of dysbiotic bacteria in the gut as well? Is that something you're
yes, that's definitely a very relevant consideration because, yeah, there's plenty of microbes that are capable of converting tryptophan. So it's always relevant, I think, when we see these layouts for the role that B6 is playing here, and of course to add to that context. So yes, whenever I am seeing not only these imbalances, but also a clear explanation for them, then that's where I'm going to head with it. In other words, at this stage, we're always at the point where we are being given a number of patterns that we can take and run with, knowing that they are definitely in play, that whatever angle we look at it, we're showing low B6 as a driver of these patterns. And then we're also being given some questions. For example, could there be any fermentation of serotonin in the gut? There's certainly signs that there's a lot of it about. And so, yeah, that's definitely a question that I would hold, although I wouldn't necessarily jump in on that while we've got such a clear and obvious call to tend to the B6. In other words, whether we're dealing with this particular test or any other, or indeed dealing with any person, test or no test, I'm typically separating the action points into things that we know we need to do and things that we might need to do. And having completed our initial task list, then we'd come back to that second list of questions. And often we'll find that a lot of those considerations have disappeared, but we'll also find some of them haven't. And that's where we're left with a picture that's subject to a whole lot less noise. And indeed, yeah, now we can actually see what is going to require our intervention, as it were. What cycles are still in process and need us to switch them off.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so yeah, the malabsorption dysbiosis marker is also very relevant. Now, we mentioned about the potential role of putrefaction and the way that that can inhibit the function of thyroid transport. So whenever we're seeing signs of malabsorption, that is very much a connection that I'd be keen to examine. Equally, we know that hippuric acid is one of those bacterial metabolites with the ability to directly shut that down, and that's partially elevated. There's other bacterial metabolites that we don't yet have the capacity to measure, but nonetheless, it does give us a clear idea that there's not enough investment in the gut. And that's the overriding takeaway that I would always come away with when we see the malabsorption markers. There are sometimes occasions where there's acute issues, acute challenges in either gallbladder function or pancreatic activity. So that's important to consider. But this is a very common pattern for me to see. And when I do, it's very rare that there's any acute issue that's causing an obstacle in digestive function. In most scenarios, we are seeing this as a downstream effect of the body's stress response. Or to rephrase it in a way that I think is more useful, in its forced economy mode. Because when we talk about stress, it's a bit of an overused word. And that's why I think sometimes it's helpful to consider a stress response is one where the body sees a need to get more energy into the circulation in order to meet the expected demands. If that's always playing out, well, it's going to redistribute the energy away from the detoxification, digestion, the cellular healing processes, etc. Will also divert energy away from the prefrontal cortex in our brains, which is very relevant for mood and mental clarity and ability to plan and learn and timeline, and has a huge impact on how we feel. So yeah, big effect. And most of this is actually conducted through the role of the vagus nerve. So this is where the vagus nerve, when active, will actively and directly innervate the liver, the gallbladder, and the digestive tract in general. So yeah, whenever we're seeing this pattern, I'm very interested in considering, well, how much of this is simply down to redistribution of energy. And we can measure the impact. We can measure the tone of the vagus nerve through heart rate variability measurements, which we'll talk about in a second. But in any case, yeah, straight away, it can be very tempting to look at these markers and think, well, he's got bacterial dysbiosis and especially some fungal dysbiosis. Let's throw some antimicrobials at him. Let's get this microbiome in ship shape and let's ease that burden from him. And whilst it would be a fantastic thing to be able to ease that burden, I very much doubt anyone in these early stages, one whereby we're seeing a very specific disinvestment in intestinal function, and thus some very disturbed conditions there. Do we think it's realistic for them to actually wage war on these microbes and win? I'm going to say absolutely not. It's just not something I've ever seen work in those early stages. These individuals need enough resources to maintain some sort of basic intestinal activity, some sort of reasonable conditions in the gut before we can expect to be able to go ahead and make a difference there. In short, if the conditions are friendly for the bad guys, they're not going to be able to be eradicated under the usual processes that would work for others. Methylation markers relevant here because we can see that the form, glutamic acid is quite high. And why does that rise? Because folate is important for the enzyme that would otherwise conduct the onwards conversion. So very easy means of assessing folate status there. And so straight away, it's worth considering, well, what impact could that have across the body? Methylation is important for 600 different reactions across the body, huge involvement in hormonal regulation, in detoxification, equally in immune activity, cellular regeneration, and potentially most important for the scenario we're discussing here is its role in neurotransmitters. The methylation effect can allow for better formation of acetylcholine, but folate directly helps to form the monoamines, that is to say, serotonin and dopamine, both of which have a very potent effect on how we feel. So big deal for anyone who's often reacting badly to items that change the sensory transmission within the central nervous system. One of the last markers on the test is the lipid peroxide, so hardly unusual to find. We already saw that there were some signs of that hypoxia and oxidative stress pattern in the mitochondria, which always tends to come together. So nothing spectacular here, but certainly some signs that either A, we want to reduce the oxidative stress, and potentially that's controlling inflammation, a very potent source of oxidative stress, or indeed support the mitochondria, which is the other way we expect oxidative stress to occur, or indeed compensate in the short term with some antioxidant support. So I mentioned earlier about the need to look into the role of iron, and as to whether we were seeing that contribute to the formation of rust, and indeed as a result contributing to the poor signaling in the mitochondria's oxygen sensors. And so it's very, very relevant that his ferritin was super high. Now, he did not have hemochromatosis, but had simply accumulated iron at a particularly substantial level. And the problem with this is that once we cross a certain threshold, too much iron ends up in the cells. Now that iron and oxygen react to form too much hydroxyl radicals, aka rust, which then convinces the oxygen sensors that, well, there must be tons of oxygen, because why would we have all of this rust otherwise? And so the hypoxia response doesn't occur. And as well as not seeing the induction of the glycolysis, a backup energy pathway, we also don't see the compensation to help with improved oxygen delivery, which would otherwise remodel some of the capillaries near the cells. And we don't see the uptake of the oxygen using apparatus, by which I mean copper. So this is where you can eat copper containing foods. For example, liver is a great source. And yet in these scenarios, it often makes zero difference to the copper and the ceruloplasmin status in the bloodstream. And so we've got ourselves a self-perpetuating cycle, because what does the body need to move iron out of the cells? It does that through the use of copper. If you haven't got that, you can't get the iron out of the cells. The iron stays in the cells, continues to drive the rust, continues to impact on that hypoxia response, and thus it doesn't call for the copper, and onwards it goes. So straight away we've actually seen a really important pattern that the organic acids test was key in highlighting. We've then gone and contextualized it with the blood tests, and that's where I had suggested he speak to his doctor about blood donations, and that was a really helpful thing for him to do in these examples. And yes, anytime we see that exceptionally high ferritin, that's the only thing that has been helpful to get on top of it. Another interesting pattern, hematocrit, 45.6. So that's a pretty high level of hematocrit, something you'd associate with individuals doing some altitude training, or at least very regularly engaging in aerobic training, which he was not. The reason why hematocrit can rise is because of sustained spells of very low oxygen. So of course there's that involvement with the mitochondrial picture as well. But equally, a question I would always ask there is as to the role of sleep apnea. And equally, will we see an improvement if somebody was to start taping their mouth at night? And indeed, that's what it showed when we did a retest later on. Raised cholesterol, nothing unusual about that. I won't labor the point. If we ever see any slowdown in the mitochondria's activity, which of course we clearly do, or if we see any signs of low cellular activity of thyroid hormones, and certainly the clues for it here, we would expect to see raised cholesterol, because A, the mitochondria is not sucking up the energy. Where's it going to go? The liver often ends up playing the role of sponge, and will try and squeeze out the cholesterol onto those lipoproteins, which is what we are picking up on the blood test. And equally, yeah, thyroid hormone, so crucial for the turnover of cholesterol. So very common to see, and normally is a downstream factor for the mitochondrial issues. Thus, I'm focused very much on dealing with those mitochondrial issues. I'm not so interested in trying to manage the cholesterol directly because I don't expect it to work until the cause is tended to. Thyroid panel, all markers within healthy range. That's so common even whenever we see the low cellular thyroid marker, and then heart rate variability. Those of you who are used to heart rate variability testing would be right in thinking this is a really, really low figure, which shows very low parasympathetic tone. What do we need to know about heart rate variability? Well, whenever we breathe in, we activate our sympathetic nervous system, and thus heart rate rises. Whenever we breathe out, we activate our parasympathetic nervous system. Heart rate drops. And provided there is a reasonable level of parasympathetic activity, we can expect there to be a very nice up and down rhythm, which is what we're measuring in that variability. If there's very little parasympathetic activity, you just don't get that downward slant in the same way. You don't get the same variability. And that's how we get insights as to the role of parasympathetic tone. There are some nuances to heart rate variability. So the most recent article I put on my website actually dives into those nuances. But the takeaway there is that heart rate variability testing is so useful, not only to track responses to the recommendations we've made, but also to get a nice idea of where is somebody at and how much resources does the system have. That's what the parasympathetic nervous system is responding to at all times. If we've got the resources, they're not being called for in order to mobilize us to get ready for an expected challenge, well, then they're left to make use of. And that's where we see stronger vagal tone to tell the liver, the gut, the prefrontal cortex, whichever part of the body we're talking about. The vagus nerve says, take this energy and use it. It provides the permission to do so. So very, very useful from our perspective. But equally, when we have real life frontline conversations with individuals who want us to play the role of mechanic, and that is to say, here's my body, fix it because it's not working. This can be a very useful centerpiece to our discussion to say, well, look, I can't actually expect my pro-health interventions to do the job while your lifestyle is pro-illness. And here's the heart rate variability to show the load your system is under, to quantify it, and thus yield a little bit of buy-in, which wasn't the easiest thing on this particular case.
Is there a particular device that you use, Marek, to measure heart rate variability?
So I personally have an Aura ring, which is probably the most common way of measuring heart rate variability. It's a really nice, convenient thing. I place it on my finger at night. I take it off in the morning, connect it up to the app on the phone, and I get all the data for my sleep and for the heart rate variability overnight. It's great, but not everybody wants to spend £300 on a ring, which is very understandable. And so some clients will do so. Others will buy a smart band, which is normally about half the cost, and do the exact same thing with it. But also you can get a whole variety of apps where they're using the camera on any smartphone to pick up on the pulse. And that's the exact same technology that's in the Aura ring. The Aura ring just contains a little infrared camera. That's sort of how it's measuring it. So it is the same technology. It's very well validated in the literature too. And so, yeah, for the cost of £4 or £7, depending on whether you're Android or Apple, plus using the smartphone that almost all of our clients have got, that is a very valid, very useful way that we can actually gather those insights. And so whether they want to do it every day upon waking up, or even just twice a week, that's still going to be enough for us to be able to form a pattern over time. And so easy, so cheap for them to provide that data. So yeah, therapeutic aims. Yeah, we've obviously seen that there's a digestive issue, and it's one of the easiest avenues through which we can reduce the burden on that individual. As much as the long-term aim is that we don't want him to need any digestive support. In the short term, it's clear the investment isn't occurring the way we want it to. And so this is where some all-purpose support can go a long way, be that betaine hydrochloride or digestive enzymes or Swedish bitters. These can be really useful just to allow better breakdown so that he gets fed more effectively rather than some of those undesirable microbes. Equally allows for better movements, and that's an environment whereby there's less fermentation. That's a big deal for us, for the role of certain metabolites in the mitochondria, but especially for the role of certain metabolites on thyroid signaling. And when I see that, I will typically provide some charcoal as well mid-afternoon to reduce the impact that might be having. We've mentioned the role of mitochondrial performance, huge focus there on the failed hypoxia response, which relates to the excessive rust that's confusing the oxygen sensors. And therefore, not only do we want to take a look into dealing with that iron excess, and of course, in this case, he went off to donate some blood. But equally, the role of the stress-induced opening of the gut lining and the inflammation and the nitric oxide that occurred. We've also got that question of the hydrogen sulfide, which we can answer with the stool test. Something to follow. But obviously, yeah, we've already touched on the role of stress in regards to that oxygen management. It's definitely something that isn't intuitively what we'd connect up, and yet it's so integral to that bigger picture. But equally, we know that anytime he takes an item that improves his central nervous system function, that enhances sensory signaling in any way, he'll typically feel good in the daytime, but then struggles to get to sleep. And this is quite common when individuals have a maladaptive association between some of those core sensations. And yeah, that's where they interpret these changes in their inner environment as uncertainty, as a potential threat. And this is where they need to update these maladaptive associations. In other words, to undertake some rewiring. And that's where the somatic approaches, be that somatic experiencing or Reichian therapy, it's not Reiki, Reichian therapy is something different, or similar approaches, or indeed, Feldenkrais, craniosacral, or breath work, especially transformational breath work or holotropic breath work, can be really helpful to just break the usual cycle that we see holding people back. That is to say, really, all we need to happen for this rewiring and updating of old associations to occur is for this individual to experience the sensation while nothing bad happens. And in doing so, those reptilian structures of the brain, the ones that are reflexive in their behavior and thus do not respond to logic, do not respond to mindset change, well, they will only respond to experience. The problem, of course, being just before we get to the point of experiencing, those very same reptilian zones are designed to kick in and thrust our physiology into a mode where we're better equipped to deal with threats. In other words, we are numbed and launched into an external focus, the exact opposite state we want for this introspective, experiential process which allows the rewiring. So that's where a lot of these external referrals I'll make for somatic work are all very much dedicated to avoiding that undue stress response, whilst also amplifying the basic sensation so that they can reach that point where they're fully experienced and nothing bad happens, at which point we see that automatic rewiring. And the reptilian zones, those reflex zones, have now been shown that they do not need to kick off when those signals emerge, and thus the individual doesn't constantly end up getting the impact of the stress response without feeling any of the sensations, which would inevitably be the case if there was that reflexive response allowed to play out. So that's what I mean by rewiring, but equally the top-down regulation can play a big role. This is all about the prefrontal cortex. And the way that we experience life is actually our prefrontal cortex does a great job of simulating all of the likely realities here and then switching off, cancelling out those that do not fit the input it's receiving. And in that regard, when we have poor energy status, and especially when we have low thyroid signaling, it can be very much the case that we don't have that same ability to cancel off the non-appropriate circumstances. As such, the body prepares its energy budget to deal with them all, which is a huge waste of energy. And of course, what happens when the body wants more energy than it has? It activates that same stress response. So two different angles, one of which is very much something that the nutritional support we're talking about today can handle in terms of the energy support, the potential changes in thyroid transport, so as cells have more thyroid activity. That's something that we can attend to. The sensory signaling is something we want to refer outwards to the somatic practitioners. And that somatic approach has been very successful in these paradoxical responses, whereas traditional talking therapy, whilst it definitely has its value, hasn't been so helpful in these particular scenarios. Okay, so what do we take a look at? So we gradually increased his carbohydrates and especially made a play for much more calorific intake. Obviously, it sounds like such a basic change to make, and it is a basic change to make, but it's so often the case that we can overlook it. We can sometimes look at these 75 different markers on the organic acids test and see such therapeutic gold and put together a really well thought out plan to attend to them without doing that one thing and checking, are they eating enough? Because if they're not, then that's a huge chronic ongoing stressor, which is going to force the body into these defensive positions, force the body into being in economy mode so that it doesn't get to invest in the gut and a lot of other things that we want. So big deal there. Supplements, we touched on the role of the digestive support, but I also wanted to add the creatine, ribose, and pyruvate. These are very much compensation. So the idea is that long term, he's not going to need them, but when the cell has been subject to low energy status, it is likely to overly use these nutrients, and thus this is where providing creatine can mean that he's got a little bit more of the floating batteries, which is the role of the creatine phosphate system within the cell. It's a temporary backup, and that can be helpful to avoid continual cellular bankruptcy when it comes to energy. Same goes for ribose, which helps him to form the backbone that can then become ATP, overcome some of those self-perpetuating cycles. Licorice root is one that I often use whenever we want to provide that calming response to excessive stress response. As we mentioned earlier, it is an inevitable challenge that comes with long-term stress, and therefore long-term opening up of the gut lining, long-term entering of endotoxins into the bloodstream, one of the consequences we can always expect there is a downregulation of cortisol receptors. It's not the only receptors that are downregulated, but that is a tragedy for our aims, primarily because without the cortisol activity, we can't expect an effective shutdown of the stress response. Without that cortisol activity, we can't expect control of the inflammatory response, which agitates the system directly, but also through that nitric oxide production, and therefore the competition with oxygen, that is going to force the body to deploy more of a stress response just to get through the normal day. So licorice root can be a really helpful item to actually enhance availability of cortisol at cellular level. There are other options we can look at in regards to managing cortisol, Korean ginseng being a perfect example, that boosts the cellular sensitivity, that works directly on the cortisol receptors. But Korean ginseng is one of the most reliable ways of switching on the brain, and that wouldn't be something I'd expect to go well in this scenario. For the very same reason, I just held back on bringing in the folate and the B6, hence why it's arranged as its own column there, because there's a big impact that folate has on dopamine and serotonin. So too B6. Folate works at the start of that pathway that ends up with the formation of these two neurotransmitters. B6 works at the final enzymatic step to form them. So both are a big deal. So we wanted to bring them in gradually. Now, the lifestyle, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know, I mean, really truly should be stopping for questions pretty soon. It would be great to have at least 10 minutes. And so we've got maybe another couple of minutes to go for the last few slides. Is that okay?
No, absolutely fine. So, yeah, the lifestyle interventions are generally self-explanatory, and we've touched on all of those, apart from the chiropractic adjustments, which, yeah, I alluded to the role of tension earlier on, and that can be an interesting combo. And we touched on the blood donation as well. So, yeah, in terms of what we saw, we did see some improvement in digestion. Of course, we were still some distance from optimal function, but better. We could see that with the improved energy support, something we'd anticipate in helping that top-down regulation we spoke of, suddenly B6 was no longer causing the same problems. Licorice root was a challenge. That relaxed him. All the signs that the adrenaline that was dominating the picture had suddenly dissipated. Great. The problem, of course, is much like when he slept for longer, much like when he reduced the stress of high training load. It put him face to face with a numbed inner environment, which was a challenge. And the key thing there is that this often does happen when clients are recommended to do some transformational breath work, etc. And they think, well, I'll do that bit a bit later, because if they haven't had that opportunity to go through that rewiring process, then that change in the inner environment for better is still going to be a big challenge for him. So yes, definitely explained how we needed to give him another option. So it wasn't just high adrenaline, readiness, numbed, or indeed subject to that challenge in the new environment. So I made the point that I would have expected this to go wrong without some sort of rewiring process occurring alongside. He accepted that and took action. But we also tried to help him with his dopamine activity when the adrenaline dropped, so he wasn't in such of a zombie state without it. Dopamine can be great for that alertness and focus without the physiology shift that comes with dopamine. And one point to touch on there, tyrosine is in theory a great way of supporting dopamine, but normally the enzymes that convert it into dopamine may be subject to downregulation in low energy states. Cordyceps can help with the expression of that enzyme, and I'll often use those two together. Cold showers allow for the production of noradrenaline to just give him a bit more focus. Lion's mane, very relevant for increased neuroplasticity in that prefrontal cortex. So again, giving him a better physiological basis for the control of the stress response. We went back to some of those similar places, now better tolerated. Great response from transformational breath work, and suddenly we're starting to see a shift in the sleep. And yeah, it wasn't immediately a consistent thing, but straight away is now hitting some heights and actually experiencing great sleep. We then went to check the gut test, saw some hydrogen sulfide, something that can contribute to that low oxygen environment, saw some parasites, dealt with both, and that gave him that increased strength, energy, focus. It was definitely very relevant. And then we were able to bring in the ginseng. First time did go wrong, but second time, bringing it in slowly, after bringing in the TRE as an additional means of removing physical tension and removing the blockages to those inner sensations that meant that his amygdala can get activated without him knowing. We dealt with that and onwards we went, at which point he was in a very decent place, and then we dealt with the antimicrobial steps now that he actually had more resources to do so. So yeah, organic acids test, what did we see on that one? Yeah, substantial improvement in a whole number of ranges, and hopefully it has been helpful to see exactly what the mechanics and the considerations were behind achieving such a potent change. And rest.
Thank you so much, Marek. Lots of clinical pearls to take in there. I've been making some notes here, so I'll have to look through them properly later and absorb it all. So we've got some time now for some questions. We've got a few already written in, but if you'd like to ask a question, please write it in the questions tab on the control panel for GoToWebinar. So the first question is, in the presence of high lactic acid, Marek, and this person is actually asking about that in the blood, so not actually in the organic acids test. What can be the reason for that other than excessive exercise?
So yeah, if we're seeing high lactic acid, the first consideration is always mitochondrial issues. In this example, we've seen circumstances of a failed hypoxia response, but in most individuals that don't have unexplained or chronic issues, yeah, what happens if there's mitochondrial challenges? The body turns to its backup energy supply, and that is the lactic acid system, aka the glycolytic system, and it's always readily available. It's inefficient though, and often the rise in lactic acid can cause the familiar pains that we get if we are pushing ourselves during exercise. So that would always be the first question to ask. Always, I would be looking at an organic acids test to assess the mitochondria. It is another consideration would be bacterial fermentation that forms lactic acids. Not as common, but it's also possible. So that's when, if the mitochondrial picture hasn't explained it, then I would be looking very much into the GI effects and see, okay, what is that telling us about species that we know are capable of pumping out that level of lactic acid?
Great, thank you. Another question here is asking about the malabsorption dysbiosis markers. So the question is that whether they have a high or low penetration across the blood-brain barrier, and is that known, please? I'm not aware of that myself.
No, so we know that they clearly cross the intestinal barrier. They need to, because otherwise they can't end up in the urine, which is where we're collecting them from. However, equally, knowing that one of these markers is indole acetic acid. So this is formed from indoles. We know indoles cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. So the question is, do we see any alteration in brain function here? No, I would not suspect they cross the brain barrier, but as you said, I don't think that's ever been assessed.
Yeah. Okay. Another question is going back to the app that you mentioned about measuring heart rate variability. So do you remember the app that you mentioned
Yes.
there?
There's actually a number of apps that you can make use of. A lot of them are very good and easy to use. The one that I recommend most often for the individuals I'm working with is camera heart rate variability. And the reason why I like that is, as well as it being easy to use, it allows for a nice bit of visual data on the data export. What the client does to get the information to me is simply open up the app, having collected their measurements over weeks or even months, and they just press data export and add my email address. And why I like that particular app is that occasionally we will see extraordinarily high levels of heart rate variability that just are not reflective of human physiology. And that app allows you to look at the beat to beat recordings, which you can just visualize really quickly in Microsoft Excel. And if they're all over the shop, you know that they're actually experiencing palpitations or added beats, and thus the marker is invalid, and that actually you've got something else to tend to. So yeah, that's why I like camera heart rate variability as an app, but there's several that are very good.
And in terms of the approaches, the therapeutic approaches to help improve someone's heart rate variability, which one out of the ones that you mentioned would you say is the most effective?
So when it comes to heart rate variability, I think sometimes it is overly simplified and boiled down to heart rate variability equals how stressed we are. Whereas actually heart rate variability equals what is our parasympathetic tone that's going into the cardiac muscle. And the reason why that's nuanced is because sometimes we will see parasympathetic tone induced not for rest and digest, not because of healthy relaxation, but because the body is overwhelmed and it's shutting down in a near hibernation state that we would call freeze. That's one nuance that's really important to recognize so that we don't get caught out. But also, when I look at parasympathetic tone, it's important to look at what contributes to that. It's energy availability, which is mitochondrial function, and energy signaling, which we can link to insulin sensitivity, thyroid signaling, minus the theft of those resources by the stress response and the inflammatory response. So yes, on a day-to-day basis, most human beings out there using heart rate variability measurements, the one variability for them is going to be the stress levels that they're under. For us in the work that we're doing, we're directly influencing nutrient status that controls mitochondrial function or influences inflammation. So consequently, yeah, we can have more than one way to change that. So it's not all about, oh, you need to do some meditation or go and see a practitioner of those somatic approaches I mentioned. Those are probably good ideas if you're human, but equally, yeah, it's a case of laying out, here's the basic 4 contributors: energy production, energy signaling, and theft from stress, theft from inflammation. Which ones are most relevant for this individual? What do we want to do about it? So right at the start, I wouldn't even worry about trying to determine, is it more this or more that? Because it's always going to be all 4. And at the start, we've normally got some really obvious steps that we need to take anyway. So I would suggest let's take them, and then let's see which change, which intervention actually had the biggest impact, and we'll start to build a more detailed picture that way by the time it comes to that second phase, when we've given that individual a fair chance and certain patterns have improved and disappeared. Certain patterns have remained resistant and call for further intervention. That's how I would go about it.
Okay, thank you. Are you okay to answer a couple more questions, Marek? I know that we've run over time.
Okay, yeah, exactly. It's an all-you-can-ask buffet, so go ahead.
Be careful what you say, because you'll get a flurry of more. So there's just a question about the licorice. So we, as nutritional therapists, have typically been taught that licorice increases cortisol. So with your using it in this circumstance of someone that is highly stressed, how does that work with calming him down?
So yeah, I think that if there's any one area that is subject to misunderstanding, it is the role of cortisol. I do have an article on my website specifically about this, entitled "Is Cortisol Good or Bad?" But I'm going to give you the spoiler right now. The key thing there is that yes, we are taught that cortisol is bad. Cortisol is neurotoxic. And the problem with that is that anytime you give an acute dose of cortisol to humans or animals studied in the literature, it has a very potent effect on reducing the stress response and supporting brain health. The problem, of course, is that when we look at a ton of different studies, almost all of them are actually measuring not the role of cortisol, but the impact when you give tons of it over a sustained period of time. What happens when you give tons of cortisol for a long period of time? You get downregulation of the receptors. And that's where we see basically cortisol insensitivity, cortisol resistance. And that's a really big deal. That's why there's so much confusion when you get an individual who's showing massive fluctuations in blood sugar level. They're showing dysregulation of inflammatory cascades. They get easy bruising. They have poor sleep-wake cycles. They're not able to wake up in the morning or switch off at night. All of these things that you associate with low cortisol and are very well defined as such. And yet you do the adrenal stress profile, and it's like, well, actually, the cortisol levels don't look that bad. This is where cortisol sensitivity is one of the missing parts of the picture. And understanding that is such a powerful step in order to not only understand the patterns that we're seeing, but to predict exactly how they'll play out with cortisol support, and thus help individuals get stable quicker. So in that regard, I would be very keen to look at the adrenal stress profile in context. That is to say, has this person been subject to long-term stress? That's normally very easy to answer. And equally, yeah, can we add to that picture with the heart rate variability testing? If that measure is less than 35 RMSSD, we can be confident that they are in a fully active fight and flight response. In other words, they are definitely going to be subject not only to high levels of cortisol production for long periods of time, but also that opening up of the gut lining and the endotoxins that come in that have a devastating impact on cortisol sensitivity through downregulating those receptors. So in that regard, if they show the need for cortisol clinically, but they're showing high levels of cortisol in the system, then yes, I'm very much looking at a means to enhance the sensitivity. Phosphatidylserine, Korean ginseng can be helpful, but normally as an interim measure to stabilize the system without too much switching on of the circuitry in their brain, which of course is what we wanted to do here. It's not always a consideration, but that's when I would use licorice as an interim measure. And of course, yes, we want to be considerate of, could there be some downstream negatives to having high cortisol? What would that involve? High blood pressure being an excellent marker. So yeah, we want to track those and the general picture, and then move him over to something that's going to work better, and then more specifically for what's actually the challenge here. And if that's cortisol resistance, then yeah, green ginseng, fantastic step. But equally, anything that reduces stress activation, anything that helps to reduce the opening up of the gut lining, these all play their role. So I hope that makes sense, because yes, there is categorically this cortisol phobia within our entire world, and yet actually when we look at the literature from the lens of what we're actually seeing here, of course, high cortisol is associated with bad outcomes, but those bad outcomes occur in the instance of poor cortisol activity, which is inevitable if cortisol is too high for too long.
So essentially, licorice is improving that cortisol activity.
Yes,
and
exactly. And yeah, the interesting thing is how obvious a change we see when we do so. There's no one who's not going to show some physiological effects from that, and we can measure a lot of those with the sort of under the hood metrics. That being said, anyone who hasn't got any challenge with the sensory transmission and their response to that, they're going to notice it.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I mean, we have one more question. Is that okay? I'm just a bit nervous. We've gone quite over time, but I just want to make sure. There's just so much to learn. So just one more question about the significance if ferritin is normal but transferrin saturation is high.
Okay, so if transferrin, well, first I'll take a step back. So you can measure serum iron, transferrin, and ferritin. That would be your standard iron panel. So iron is how much iron is in the bloodstream. Transferrin is how much iron is currently able to be transported in the bloodstream, whereas ferritin relates to iron in storage. So this is why whenever you want to look at iron, you always want to take a look into what is going on across circulation and storage, because so often people come to me, they've been to the doctor and they've just got a ferritin marker. I can't do much with that. I need to see the context in which we're finding that. So yes, if we're seeing high transferrin saturation, that means we've got plenty of iron, but we haven't got a lot of transferrin. So it's very relevant there that transferrin is a direct target of EPO, erythropoietin. So that's most famous as a drug. It's injected by Tour de France cyclists to boost their oxygen carrying capacity. However, we manufacture it all day, every day, primarily in the kidneys. So yes, if we're seeing that there isn't any disturbance in the hypoxia picture, of course, the organic acid test is vital to look into there, exactly what we've discussed today. If we're not seeing that disturbance, but we are seeing the lower transferrin relative to iron, that would indicate to me we're just looking at one blockage in one place, and I would immediately hone in on the EPO production of the kidneys. Specifically, could there be any localized inflammation going on there, potentially due to a local infection, or potentially because the kidneys are being injured by doing too much work, which itself is normally downstream from the liver, gallbladder, digestive tract axis not being used effectively. In other words, if there's not investment in that primary detoxification pathway, the one that's very well equipped to handle a lot of toxic chemicals, the body often starts overusing the kidney, and sometimes we'll see those challenges. There's occasionally questions we might want to ask for, say, heavy metals as well within that same context. But yes, straight away, I'm looking at kidney as a potential route to explain that. Normally, we'll want to do a bit more investigation there.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I had no idea about that. So lots of learning. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking with us. And what I'll do, Marek, is I'll add the information on that last slide into my email for everyone with the recording link in there so that they have the information handy.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really informative, and as always, lots of learning, which is, you know, what we all want at the end of the day. So hopefully we'll speak soon, Marek, and thank you so much for your time, your effort with putting the slides together and the information. Really appreciative.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
No problem. It was a pleasure to have you. So hopefully we'll have another opportunity to do one of these at some point in the next year.
Definitely.
All right, take care.
Thank
Speak
you very
soon.
much.
Bye-bye.